Well, I am amazed because I was here after the 99, 2000, 2001 pine beetle outbreak, where pine was a four-letter word, and folks wanted to know, what do you do post-pine beetle in Cumberland County and White County and Fentress County and Van Buren and all the counties around here? And pine was not a very good word at that time. And Clarence, I can remember back in the 90s with George Weaver and those folks when pine and clear cutting on Catoosa was just verboten and so forth. So I'm really amazed how many people are here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the, I want to do the other one. Yeah. I know, that's fine. First of all, I'm a hardwood guy. So I got interested in shortleaf pine because if there's a pine that acts like a hardwood, it's shortleaf pine. It sprouts, it does a lot of different things, it grows, it's sort of a space-enduring species. It doesn't grow fast, it doesn't grow slowly necessarily, it's just sort of an average. And it sprouts, one of the few pines that sprout. And one of the things, along with the citizens of Tennessee, that is sort of interesting is that shortleaf, as Chris talked about earlier, especially on the plateau, pine used to make up 20 or 25% of the species composition pre-1950. And all of a sudden, it's like pine is not a native species to the Cumberland Plateau. And that's not true. It's always been here. So we think one of my focuses is working with private landowners. And with private landowners, we've got in this area, as you go north, probably about 3 million acres of forest land that is in this dilapidated, low productivity condition, degraded hardwoods. And if we could insert some pine into that, whether we talk about different community types or so forth, you can actually probably raise the awareness, the profitability, and the management of that acreage. So that's one of the reasons I'm into this, is part of my responsibility as private landowners and giving them something to shoot for. So I want to talk a little bit about history. Clarence did a good job with that. The natural regeneration properties, because that's one of the reasons we have a decline in shortleaf pine, why shortleaf pine has become a threatened species, the perils of planting shortleaf pine, and start thinking about some reforestation objectives. So how did we get these shortleaf pine stands? How did they come about? And really about 150 years ago, we had even age stands of more or less predominantly shortleaf pine. Now, this is even before all the burning started taking place with turn of the century, 1900. These stands were dense, they began to stagnate, you had tree mortality, then along in the 20s and 30s, you started having harvesting. And what actually happened right here in this area is the railroad went down the east side of the valley, east side of the plateau in the valley, went to Chattanooga, then went back up to Nashville because they couldn't get over the mountain at Rockwood. They couldn't get the train up across there. And it wasn't until 1920 till they built a track that went across the plateau right through Cumberland County. So that's when a lot of the harvesting and so forth took place. Now, all these stand conditions were not very conducive to natural regeneration. And the point that I want to make is, and this is really a lot different than a lot of folks think, but the pine was older than the hardwood in these areas. Generally, you had pine, it established, it deteriorated over time. Natural succession allowed hardwoods to come onto the scene, And then we harvested the pine again. We had some pine remnants, but the pine was older than the resident hardwoods here because we never naturally regenerated it. And I'm going to talk about why. But Martin, hold up the disc that I brought with me. That was cut on our research center, education research center at Oak Ridge. That's a 160-year-old shortleaf pine. Our oldest hardwood there is 130 years old. So that predated the hardwoods in that area. And we found the same thing up at Chuck Swan and some other areas. So you actually had a two-cohort stand. You had the older pine, and we don't think of shortleaf pine, I mean pine in general, but shortleaf being older than the hardwoods that are on the site. So you take something that looks like this, which is a shortleaf pine remnant, and that tree is probably about 30 years older than the residual hardwoods in that photo. The shortleaf pine continued to diminish because we didn't create conditions for regeneration, exactly what Chris was talking about with the seed sap and the medium size and the large size trees. As the trees started to get older, as we all do, as we get older, we decline. They become more susceptible to pine beetle outbreaks, and we've had our share of those. Then we had fire control programs. Division of Forestry, 1950s, did a fabulous job taking care of fire. But that probably didn't help the shortleaf pine. And so the conditions to regenerate shortleaf pine was not present. We didn't get any new cohorts, new age classes. And then as the pine diminished, just like we are, as you get old, you don't reproduce as well. Trees may be a different scale, but as you get older, the seed source wasn't there or the trees were already gone. Now, here's the natural regeneration principles with shortleaf pine. And what is very interesting about this is all this has got to come together at the same time. First, it's not a prolific seeder. Loblolly, you can get seed every couple years, and you'll get lots of it. Shortleaf is few and erratic. Sometimes you get a bumper seed crop about every 3 to 10 years. Now, you got to have a bumper seed crop because there's all kinds of things that like seed. Small mammals, birds, and so forth. So you got to have enough seed to expand beyond what the natural predators take in themselves. You have to have bare mineral soil. Those seeds are tiny. They have very little energy. They don't have enough energy to get when they germinate, the radical down through a forest duff into the mineral soil. So you got to have mineral soil. And then in any time during a tree's life, the most risky period is germination in seedlings. If you don't have the moisture, the little germinating seedling's going to die. So all that has got to come together at one point. So here is a little area where we did, all those things came together and we got some natural shortleaf pine regeneration. A lot of it. Now here's the seed properties, and this goes back to the Woody Plant Seed Manual. Very small seed of shortleaf. 2 or 3 pounds of seed comes from 100 pounds of shortleaf pine cones. Okay? There's 43,000 seed in a pound, and somebody did some work in natural conditions that said for every average of 100 seeds, you might get 1 seedling. That's 1%. And then you have the consumption and the bumper seed crops and so forth. So successful regeneration from seed varies by, you got to have that bare mineral soil seedbed condition. You have to have a good bumper seed year. Environmental conditions, primarily moisture, so that seed doesn't, and that seedling doesn't dry out and die. And you probably have to control ground competition. Another take-home message in this is shortleaf pine is not a competitor. It doesn't like competition. All must be present for natural regeneration. Does not happen frequently. And it may be the exception more than the rule. So there's your reasoning why shortleaf, natural shortleaf, has declined over the years. Now I throw this as a seed tree where we left trees and so forth, and it reminds me that Steve Patrick and Ken Arney took me to a place that they had worked at Catoosa when I first came to Tennessee, and Steve, that age gets away from me, but anyway. And they had tried doing seed tree with shortleaf pine, and it was a failure. Why? They didn't know when they would get the bumper seed year. That's really hard to figure out a priori. And then after you do the harvest and have the bare mineral soil, what happens when you leave that for 2 or 3 years? You're going to get all kinds of herbaceous vegetation, woody vegetation. And when you do get that seed crop, it can't get down to the mineral soil anymore. So you would have to go out and scarify it, burn it, almost every year, hoping you would have a good seed crop. Dwayne, that doesn't happen at Catoosa very often, right? Is he here? Okay. So anyway, why shortleaf pine has become more of a threatened species in this area. Conditions for natural regeneration, all of those things have to come together at one point, and that hasn't happened very often. There's a continued diminishment, and I tried to figure out last night if that was a word or not, but it sounded good. But our seed source is gone in many of our areas that we have to plant because there is no seed source. And then if you think of natural succession and so forth, that if you have hardwoods and pines growing together, you're not getting direct sunlight down on the ground to regenerate pine, pine being a shade-intolerant species. So the conditions for regeneration in the progression of natural succession isn't there. And especially in mixed pine hardwood stands, it is a very unstable community. You're not creating conditions to regenerate the pine, and it's going to succeed. Succession will proceed or succeed toward more hardwood species as the pine goes out. So, perils of planting. Now, we've got a lot of planting going on. I get a lot of phone calls. Will planted trees simulate natural stands? That's a good question. Something I want to talk about here in a minute. Can fire be used to enhance shortleaf pine? Maybe. We want practices to promote shortleaf pine, and we want the same results as loblolly pine. Our foresters are sort of like, they have great memories, and they think, well, if it doesn't perform like loblolly pine, then it's secondary. And and then we got to find where shortleaf pine competes best on these site productivities. Why did the industry decide against shortleaf pine? And they had good reasons. Basil crook, they machine planted a lot of trees. That basil crook was heck on machine planted. So they liked loblolly compared to shortleaf. Survival of shortleaf is highly variable. It's fairly inconsistent. You can get anything from 50 to 60 to 80 to 90%. They wanted consistency. They didn't want to go back and replant. Loblolly, gee whiz, if you don't get 85%, you're not there. Loblolly is a very plastic species. That means it can grow on a lot of sites. Even though the range of shortleaf is wide, its sites that it survives on generally are more limited. So the industry could plant loblolly in a lot of different places. It has slower growth. That doesn't bother some of us, but because the growth is slower, you probably have to do more vegetation control as compared to a faster growing species. And then just realize shortleaf is it's not a competitor. It's an enduring tree. It's space enduring. So that it tends to endure, tends to huckle down a little bit rather than outgrow the competition. So you've got to do more things to bring it through. Shortleaf pine versus grasses. And this is a really fine point if you're looking at savannas. Where's all the roots in a savanna? It's in the upper portion of the soil, and it's the grass. So when you have a rainfall, what gets all the moisture? It's the grass. The moisture very rarely gets below that big, thick grass mat and gets to the tree roots. So that's a problem. There is a really fine line, and as managers, you got to decide where you're going to be with this, because optimally, you can't grow shortleaf pine and grasses, I'll say it optimally, to get the best benefits of both. Something's going to have to give, and if you're into savanna management, warm season grasses, those type of things, more than likely the shortleaf is going to suffer more than your grasses. If you burn more frequently, it's going to hurt the shortleaf pine than the grasses. If you burn less frequency, it's going to help the shortleaf pine, and you're going to probably lose some of your grass structure. So realize that there's a balance to be realized there. Burning, even though we know shortleaf sprouts, and we'll have a presentation this afternoon that talks about survival of shortleaf pine with sprouting, but trees die in fires. They don't all sprout. You need to realize that. If you look at the literature, it says shortleaf pine sprouts. My question was, can we depend on it? What is your sprouting percentage after you do a burn? Good question. So we've all seen this. It sprouts pretty good. Now we have questions, will those sprouts become pretty decent trees? And we're looking at that through some of our work. Fire kills trees, so you have to balance the needs of your grass structure, your grass habitat versus the needs of the trees. That's not necessarily the same. How does fire impact the tree? First of all, trees have very fine, small roots at the soil surface, even with grass to some degree. When you have a burn, generally those roots are killed. And it takes 2 or 3 years for it to reestablish those fine roots. If you burn annually, guess what happens? Your trees are going to go downhill. So you need to understand what type of structures with trees and grass that you want. Crown scorch. Depending on how much fuel is on the ground, do you get in burning intensities that will affect trees? And how does that affect grasses? Planting procedures. I'm not going to go into all that. Most everybody knows that. We have a publication on it. Most everybody, how do you get trees from the nursery, take care of them, plant them, don't let them dry out, all those type things. But I will tell you that is my experience, and most people who have worked with shortleaf, you need to spend more money on site preparation than you do in buying the seedlings and planting the seedlings, because it is not a competitor. So if you're planting in a grassland situation or in a pasture or something, you're not going to do very well. Planting procedures. Now, here's the thing I want to bring out, and this is something that I had a revelation on a few months ago. Everybody likes these really pretty, tall, skinny, shortleaf pine trees. That looks good, doesn't it? Most all our shortleaf pine developed as fully stocked stands initially, and then as they get older, they diminish, and we have mixed pine hardwood going eventually to hardwood. But they did not develop in no competition. They developed with full stocking. Now, we're trying to grow savannas, and we're growing trees in savannas that don't have competition from trees. What are those trees going to look like? They're going to look like your yard tree, because there's nothing making them go out. They're going this way. They're going laterally. They're not growing tall. So usually these stands are planted at fairly high densities. Planting fewer trees will lead to short-bodied trees. So I am concerned because we're sort of going 180 degrees the other way and thinking about planting shortleaf in open-grown situations. And this is the opposite of how most of our stands have been established and developed in the past. So do you want trees like that? That's in eastern Kentucky. And as you notice, you got lots of crown. It's rounded, short-bodied. Is that what you want for a savanna? Now that's different than you're seeing right now, right? But trees are phototropic. They're going to grow out if there's nothing regulating them. Or do you want something like that? Notice that it had competition, made it go up instead of out. And I think this is fairly important, the form of your tree, of what you're trying to do. What is the purpose of your shortleaf pine? What are you trying to do? And this is an open-grown tree compared to one that had competition. Something to think about. Our summary is we can grow and influence shortleaf pine in many communities. And this is what's sort of neat about it. We can do it in savannas, we can do it in woodlands, we do mixed pine hardwood, we can do plantations, we can do natural regeneration. Thus, the strategies that we use will really depend on what your objectives are. What do you want your shortleaf pine to be? Or if you're in those grass savanna situations, how do you balance that out? What structure, community do you desire? What pathways are available to get there? Burning can promote sprouting of shortleaf pine. It can also kill it. Can we use the sprouting of shortleaf pine to give it an advantage when we're trying to grow shortleaf pine with other competition, be it hardwoods or grass? And the natural seed source, for the most part, in most of our area is not available anymore. So we're pretty much forced to start thinking of planting trees instead of using natural regeneration. But my point is that you're going to have to do excellent site prep to get those seedlings to be successful. So, something like that, I like that. I don't know if y'all do or not, but I like mixed pine hardwood, something along with shortleaf in that area. And I have to end with a cartoon, and this is my favorite cartoon. This week, I achieved unprecedented levels of unverifiable levels of productivity. Questions?